I had turned 50. I had been running for 7 years what I think was arguably the most successful software business at IBM. Well, we made the most successful software business at IBM, the Webster business unit, which we've grown from about $4 billion to $5 billion on the back of Webster. So I felt pretty good about that. I was not going to be the CEO of IBM. I had a number of strikes against me, not the least of which was I was Canadian. And I had a profound discussion with my wife one night about what I was going to do when I grew up. And she said, well, whatever you do it soon. And because I don't really want to be sitting around at home by myself when I'm 65. And I thought, okay, that's probably good advice. Organization where you had a founder, almost a tyrannical founder, and then a successor who emulated that style, coming in and attempting to model that style again was probably not the prescription for success. You needed to appeal to a different part of people's psyche than fear. There was enough fear going around. Remember, this is a company that did and does generate over $1 billion of free cash a year. And so, and that wasn't made up. I mean, even during the accounting fraud, the fraud was never about cash. The fraud was about timing. It was 35-day month and other crap. And it was all designed to prop up the stock price so that these guys paid themselves a lot of money. But it wasn't that the business didn't have fundamental intrinsic value. Initially, the goal that we set was finish the work with the government and get through that process. So we didn't set any explicit financial goals at that point. We just had to get through all of the regulatory and reporting issues that we had to deal with. And once we got near the end of that process, then we started to put in place the company had never had a budgetary process. There was no budgeting. I don't quite know how budgets got set, but there had never been a formal company-wide budget. Again, this is a company that has a spend of $3 billion and had never done a budget. So we had to actually invent a budgeting process. Now, you normally do a budgeting process and a strategy process sort of together. We've never done a strategy process either. And so we had a chicken and an egg problem. What was the strategy to feed the budget process? So I sat down one night and wrote a strategy. And I said, here's the strategy, that's the operating assumption to go into the budgeting process. Do not expect this complete lack of process discipline. I mean, remember I'd come out of a company that in many ways is over imbued with process. And so I imagined that CA perhaps had less process than IBM did, but I didn't imagine it had no process. And that was a complete shock. And the implications of that were even more profound when I kind of finally realized that no process actually realizes that everybody has their own process, because it's not that you don't work in a particular way, it's just that everyone's figured out their own way to work. And so that was really quite difficult to reconcile the fact that when you ask people to do something, they didn't actually know how to do it because they didn't know what process to make it happen. A company whose culture was we don't have a culture, and whose idea of a process was we don't need processes. And in fact, Charles DeLong wrote 2 very interesting books. They're actually terrible books, but if you want an interesting insight into business philosophy, you should read these, because in these books he expounds upon his theory that all process is bad, and that you should never let people develop expertise because they might get comfortable, they might get good in something, and you should change them randomly for no apparent reasons. And that was all part of the management philosophy, and that was consciously followed. So you had people who would bounce from sales jobs to finance jobs to investor relations jobs to human relations jobs, and spend 12 months at it, and then get a phone call one day and say, your new job's over here. There was no data. We would figure out how we had done the quarter before in about the 17th workday or so at the end of the quarter. So about the time we were going to announce earnings, we would figure out what had actually happened to us the quarter. And I mean, cost, I mean, revenue, I mean, there was no. I said, where's the data we used to run the business? Well, there was no data they used to run the business. It was all run by the seat of the pants. You know,
for a company that size.
Yeah. Again, this is a $4 billion company. Not a startup. And so just getting a corpus of operational data that told us what was going on and allowed us to predict what was going on. We had a couple of spectacular problems where we had predicted that our cash flow would be, you know, $1.something billion, and we ended up missing by a few $100 million. And when I went back and looked at why, it was just they had made the number up. I'm not exaggerating. They made the number up. There was no rationale for the budgeted number. It had no background to it at all. It just, you know, it was extrapolation off last year. You know, that last year's numbers seemed pretty good, so we'll pick a number that's 8% higher or something like that. They forgot about the fact that we had $200 million of favorable tax treatment, you know, a few other things. They're just astonishing. I had a minor crisis about the time when I discovered how this particular budget number was set. What I discovered was that the people that I was relying on for some of this information were basically incompetent. And I needed to refocus my energies internally and rebuild the operational side of the business. I had assumed that I had competence in some of the areas where I really didn't have it. And I became the temporary CFO, which is not a thing I advise CEOs doing, and it's certainly not a thing I advise engineer CEOs doing. But for a while it was necessary to really get my arms around what was going on in the finance industry. Think of the situation. You had every executive in finance fired. You had every executive in legal fired. The CEO, the COO, head of sales, virtually the entire senior management, the general counsel, the entire management senior ranks were gone. My problem was not a problem of deadwood, it was a problem of attracting talent. It was a problem of bringing people into a crisis situation, and frankly, a crisis in which the outcome was unknown. And I will tell you, and I mean this in the humblest possible way, that the only way you do that is by getting people to come because of you. 6 months, I would say, I spent the vast majority of my time with customers and with the development organization. I was able to sort of dig deeply into the organization and figure out what was going on. And so it was probably 50-50 inward versus outward. And then I sort of switched gears a bit and became much more outward facing. And did that for about a year until a lot of the process changes that we had set in place, all of a sudden the wheels fell off. And I had to fire a bunch of the senior executives, and then I had to become much more inward facing again, and I did that for probably 9 months. And now I've sort of switched my time to be probably more outward facing. One of the things we did was completely changed our sales model. We had a classic product-based sales force. We had 5,000 salespeople. They were organized into 5 different sales streams, so roughly 1,000 each. Every one of them was sort of independent of every other one. They were loosely organized into geographic territories, and they basically had free rein to go call on whoever they wanted in that territory. To say it was chaos would be putting a fine point on it. The customers never saw the same person twice, so despite the fact that we may not have changed the people on their account, they didn't know who was going to call on them. What true story, this happened to me 2 weeks ago. I went to call on a customer in Milwaukee. The guy pulled out a stack of business cards, put mine on top, and said, "You're the 43rd CA business card that I have, and I've been here for 5 years."